And I want to really welcome Morten Christiansen again to the language circle. I have to say, I'm a bit more nervous than for the other language circles now that Morten is here, because I've been a fan or follower, or however you want to call it, of Morten's work for years. And so I was really thrilled to finally have Morten here in the language circle. Giving a short introduction to Morten is really impossible for me. There's so many things that I would like to point out. So his career is far too diverse, and his achievements are far too many. So I'll be selective. I'll focus on the key formal aspects for the CV and the achievement that inspired our group the most. Morten is a full professor of psychology at Cornell University. He also, in parallel, as far as I understand, holds a professorship in the cognitive science of language department at the University of Aarhus in Denmark. Am I saying that all right, Morten?
Yeah, it's Aarhus, yeah.
Okay, Aarhus. I'm trying. And he's also senior scientist at Haskins Laboratories in the US. He's received a number of honors and awards, again, too many to mention them all. I'm sorry. For instance, he's a member of the Royal Norwegian Society of Sciences and Letters and of the Royal Danish Academy of Sciences and Letters. In 2017, he was an elected fellow of the Cognitive Science Society. 2009, he was an elected fellow also of the Association for Psychological Science. Morten is the author of hundreds of research papers and of numerous books, and I've only read probably two of them, and I found them both extremely readable, extremely valuable, extremely inspiring. To me, his work really is special and dear because it employs a true Darwinistic perspective to the study of language processing, acquisition, and evolution. And for a cognitive scientist, being a Darwinist comes with the implication that language can only be understood if we view it through how it is handled by our mind and brain, right? That's kind of, in a nutshell, I think what Morten's work is to me. Morten, your scientific discoveries and your intellectual reflections and your opinion pieces in your books are a major inspiration to me and major inspirations to us. And so the floor is yours. We are looking forward to your presentation a lot. Thank you very much for making it to the language circle, Morten. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lars, for inviting me to be part of this really wonderful language circle speaker series. It's a great pleasure and honor for me to be part of it. And just want to make sure everybody can hear me. Yeah, great. All right, so let me get started. I'm going to talk about language evolution through the bottleneck from milliseconds to millennia. And I'm just going to get this. All right, here we go. So a key question when it comes to language evolution is to explain why it is that language is the way it is and how it came to be that way. But it's important, I think, when it comes to approaching language evolution, that it must be part of an integrated approach to language, something which Nick Chait and I argued in an opinion piece in Nature Human Behavior back in 2017. And so what we need to do to develop a complete picture of how language works, we must look at language across multiple timescales, the timescale of processing, acquisition, and evolution. Now, unfortunately, questions about the evolution, acquisition, and processing of language have typically been treated as being independent of each other. But I think this is misguided because each can provide insights and theoretical constraints on the others. And so we need to look at language across these different timescales from millennia to milliseconds. And when it comes to language evolution, we should not be asking, why is the brain so well suited for language, for learning language? That's sort of what people often, the question that people often ask. Instead, what we should be asking is, why is language so well suited to being learned by the human brain? And that's sort of the viewpoint of people working within the cultural evolution of language. So the idea is that cultural evolution has shaped language to be as learnable as possible by the human brain. And thus, from this perspective, linguistic structure emerges through cultural transmission of language across many generations of learners and users. And this idea is not new. In fact, Darwin sort of kind of already suggested something along these lines in The Descent of Man, when he noted that the formation of different languages and of distinct species and the proofs that both have been developed through a gradual process are curiously the same. He then went on to cite the German linguist Max Müller, who was at Oxford University at the time, who said, a struggle for life is constantly going on among the words and grammatical forms in each language. The better, the shorter, the easier forms are constantly gaining the upper hand. And then from that, Darwin concluded that the survival or preservation of certain favorite words in the struggle for existence is natural selection. So here Darwin was making a parallel between biological evolution, as he talked about in The Origin of Species, and the cultural evolution of language, which he talked a little bit about in The Descent of Man. And so the idea is that structure then arises from neural constraints on how we learn and process language. So these constraints on the cultural evolution of language comes from the way our thought processes work, how we tend to conceptualize the world, and so on. But of course, our brains are not independent of our bodies. We are embodied beings, and thus limitations from our sensory motor system will also affect the cultural evolution of language. And because we live not as individuals, but as a community, constraints from social pragmatic factors will also influence the cultural evolution of language. And then, of course, there will be constraints from cognition, limitations on learning, memory, and processing that will also affect the cultural evolution of language. So together, these kind of constraints will shape the evolution of different languages across time. And so through cultural transmission, involving repeated cycles of learning and use, these constraints would have shaped language into what we see today, both across different generations of language learners and users, but also due to patterns that emerge within a particular speech community as such. But of course, this is sort of a big picture perspective. So what we really want to sort of delve into is what the specific constraints are that have shaped the cultural evolution of language. And today, I'm going to talk about one source of constraints that works across multiple timescales from milliseconds to millennia. And that constraint I'll talk about is one that I proposed with my colleague Nick Chater, namely the now or never bottleneck, which derives from the need to deal with the transient nature of linguistic input. And what we have suggested is that a key solution to the now or never bottleneck is the sort of good old-fashioned memory process of chunking, which I'll then go on and show how it might have been involved in shaping language processing, language acquisition, and language evolution, possibly leading to an intermediate abstract level of linguistic structure akin to linear sequences of parts of speech, which I'll touch upon at the very end. So as mentioned, this is theoretical work with my longtime collaborator, Nick Chater from University of Warwick in the UK. Now, everybody agrees, I think, that language happens in the here and now. If you didn't process what I just said, it's gone. There's no way you can get it unless you listen to the recording later on, of course. Likewise, if you're a language learner, you need to learn from the input when it's there before it's gone. And this creates what we have termed the now or never bottleneck. And this derives from a number of important challenges from the linguistic input, something that actually is a bit of an inconvenient truth in the language sciences, because most theoretical models don't really deal with this very much. So in the first place, the linguistic input is highly transient. So the auditory trace disappears within less than 1/10 of a second unless you do something with it, unless you process it in some way. But not only is the linguistic input highly transient, but it actually comes at us at a really rapid pace. So an average English speaker, for example, will produce about 10 to 15 phonemes per second, which translates into something like 150 words per minute. Now, interestingly, our auditory resolution, our basic auditory resolution, is actually poorer than that. So, for example, if you were to listen to more than 10 non-speech sounds per second, you wouldn't actually be able to distinguish them from one another, and they would just sort of blend into a buzz. But not only is the linguistic input highly transient and comes at it at a really fast pace, but our memory for sound sequences is also rather limited. And so in a classic experiment, Warren et al. Showed that if you give naive participants just 4 non-speech sounds that they have to remember the order of, such as a tone, a buzz, a hiss, another tone, they have a really hard time doing that. And of course, we also know from the work in the memory literature that when it comes to memory for even linguistic items, such as digits or words, our memory is rather limited. So depending on whether you're a Cowan person or a Miller person, it's roughly between 4 to 7 items. So how does our language system deal with this formidable challenge from the linguistic input? And I should mention that the same kind of challenge faces individuals using sign language, because the visual modality creates similar kind of limitations. So how does our language system deal with this? Well, the suggestion that Nick Chater and I put forward is that we do this by way of chunking. And to give you an intuitive idea about how this might work, I'm going to do a little experiment with you. So I hope you're awake, whether you're in the morning or in the evening or in the afternoon. All right. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to flash up very quickly a string of letters. And what I want you to do is just, kind of commit it to memory. And then when it disappears, there'll be a mask over it. And then once it disappears, I just want you to try to repeat the letters back to yourself. All right? Everybody ready? Okay, here goes. So remember, it's going to flash up very quickly. All right. So probably, as I imagine, most of you had a hard time trying to recall these letters, because as you can see here, there are 14 letters, which of course is way beyond our normal working memory or short-term memory capacity. But I don't want sort of you here at the language circle to feel too badly about yourself. So I'm going to give you another chance. I'm hoping that you'll do a little better here. All right? So you ready? So same thing again. Okay, here goes. Now, hopefully this time you should actually have been able to do much better than before, because if you notice, there are actually 2 words here, namely language and circle. And those of you who actually noticed that would be able to repeat back the 14 letters. And in fact, it's the same 14 letters as I showed you in the previous trial, but now in a different order, making up 2 words. So you're able to chunk these letters into 2 words, which you can remember, and then you can sort of kind of read off the letters from that afterwards. Now, what we are suggesting is something very similar is going on when we are processing language. Of course, not in the conscious way that you're doing it, but in a very similar way. And importantly, of course, for you to be able to do this chunking, that requires a tremendous amount of experience with language. So you need to know the words language and circle, how to spell it, and so on. And it's clearly something we have to learn. The same goes for other areas of language as well. So the suggestion we suggest to this sort of the pressures from the emergency of language processing is that we need to engage in what Nick Chater and I have called chunk and pass processing. We chunk the language input as quickly as possible and pass it up to higher levels of linguistic representation for further processing, and that and integration, and that allows us to sort of maintain the input for a little bit longer. Of course, this means that we have to essentially engage in incremental processing, chunking across neighboring units, and this leads to something to, the well-known effect, the garden path effects, as well as focus on local dependencies. It also provides a nice explanation for why it is that when we analyze linguistic patterns, that we seem to find them at different levels of linguistic representation, from phonology to morphology to syntax, etc. And from the viewpoint of the now and never bottleneck, it's a consequence of having to do this chunk and parse processing into increasingly more compressed representation that allow us for longer retention of information, but with less of the original detail, although we enrich it with interpretive information. Importantly, we also have to engage in predictive processing because there's very little room for backtracking. So we use top-down information from multiple cues so that we can be right first time, and in this way we use multiple kinds of information to guide current processing. And what you see here is sort of a cartoon version of how this might happen. So we have the acoustic information that we might chunk into some sort of sound-based unit. It can be phonemes, it can be syllables, whatever your favorite sound-based unit is. And then that buys you a little time, but then soon you're going to get interference between these units, just like you might have experienced when you saw the first set of letters. And so what we do is that we chunk it into a higher level of representation that can be words, multi-word combinations, and so on. And that buys us a little bit more time. And we sort of keep on repeating this process until we get to some sort of representation of the meaning of the whole message. And importantly, there are probably more levels than is indicated here. So these are only for illustrative purposes. And it's also very likely that different languages might have different ways of chunking it into the different levels, as well as we might also expect that during language development, we might gradually develop these abilities as well. Now, so far, I've talked about sort of language comprehension, but the idea is that we do something quite similar using the same principles in the opposite direction, starting when we do production, starting with some sort of representation of what we want to say. That gets turned into something like intonational phrases, which could turn into words and multi-word combinations, into some sort of sound-based representation, and into articulatory gestures that would then produce what we want to say. So to recap, the now and never bottleneck presents a formidable challenge for the language system, and chunk and parse processing is key to overcoming this challenge. What the language user must do is to rapidly compress and integrate the input with prior information at higher levels of abstraction. And this is consistent with, for example, the work from Uri Hassoun's lab at Princeton about a hierarchy of temporal receptive windows in the brain. And at the syntactic level, this also highlights the importance of multi-word chunks as building blocks of language. And this is something that I'm going to be focusing on for the remainder of the talk today. So far, I've talked about the now and never bottleneck and what it might mean for language processing. But from the integrative perspective that I was highlighting at the very beginning of the talk, we might ask, what about language acquisition? What are the implications of the now and never bottleneck for how we learn language? And here I'm going to turn to some work I've done with a former graduate student, Stuart Macaulay, who is now at University of Iowa, sorry. And the basic idea is that acquisition involves learning to process via chunking. And so what this means is that the now and never bottleneck at the time scale of the utterance have implications for the time scale of the individual, because each processing episode is an opportunity for that individual to learn how to process language. And so what language acquisition involves is learning how to engage in chunk and parse processing. essentially making it a kind of skill learning. So language acquisition is not about identifying the right grammar. The child is not a mini linguist, but rather the child is a developing language processor, as it were, that must learn how to create and integrate the right chunks rapidly before the input is gone. And so the child must learn to do this in the here and now, because there's no opportunity for batch learning. And so the child has to engage in what within computational linguistics is called ego learning, doing online learning from all available information in the input. And this means that learning will be essentially piecemeal and local, limited by memory. So abstractions will be learned over local information within the chunking window. And of course, the learning has to be predictive. The child must gradually learn to apply top-down knowledge about what was said before, what they know about the world so far, and so on, to facilitate processing via prediction. And these predictions will emerge gradually when children have developed enough chunking skills. Now, Stuart and I try to implement this in a computational model that we call the chunk-based learners. And this was inspired by the idea we wanted to capture several key psychological and computational features, including the limitations from the now and bottleneck. And these are, we wanted the model to only use online incremental learning, online processing and incremental learning over local dependencies. It employs a simple kind of statistical learning. It learns in an item-based fashion. It has a simple kind of prediction. It builds up what we call a chunkatory, which is an inventory of chunks and could be one or more words long. And we wanted a model that could do both aspects of language comprehension as well as aspects of language production. And of course, it should be exposed to naturalistic input. Here we use a corpora from the TILES database, and also it should have cross-linguistic coverage. So our model is able to capture production in 29 Old World languages. And so the aim of the model was to recreate the early language production of individual children based on the linguistic input to which they have been exposed. So we created individual models for specific children in the child's database, a total of, excuse me, 217 different child models. And learning this model in the model is quite simple. So essentially what we want the model to do is to get input from the child's database. So that's essentially the caregiver speech to an individual child. And so imagine the child has heard the cat chase the dog. And then the task in the comprehension side is to essentially do something akin to shallow parsing, namely divide the sentence into simple constituents, namely the two noun phrases, the cat, the dog, as well as the verb chased, that then can be passed up for further processing. And the way the model does that is by computing backwards transition probabilities, which is a very simple statistic that we know that young infants are capable of paying attention to. And the model keeps a running average of backward transition probabilities across that it's seen so far. And it uses this to determine whether for any two combinations of words, whether a boundary should be inserted or not. And so to illustrate, let's imagine the model is processing the sentence, the cat chased the dogs. At first it gets there as input. It doesn't do anything. It gets cat. Then it will determine whether there should be a boundary between there and cat. Let's say that it doesn't insert a boundary. It goes on to processing the next word, chased. In this case here, it inserts a boundary. It adds the chunk, the cat, to its chunkatory with a frequency of 1, and then passes the cat up for further processing. It goes on processing the next word. And again, let's say it inserts a boundary, adding chased to its chunkatory with a frequency of 1, passing it up for further processing and going on to the processing further input. So we get dog, and then we get the end of the sentence. Now, in this case, when it has the dog, it actually already has the dog in its juncatory with a frequency of 1. So what it does in this case is simply increment that by 1. So now it has a frequency of 3, given what it has seen before. And then it passes up the dog for further processing. So, of course, given this, we need some way of measuring how well the model is doing. And for that purpose, we don't think that looking at syntactic trees is the right way of doing it, in part because there seem to be a growing amount of evidence that's actually not a good measure of how even adults process language. So instead, we focused on shallow parsing, and we use off-the-shelf shallow parsers to evaluate how well the model had done on the input. And importantly, these shallow parsers are trained with a lot of information that our model doesn't have. So things like it will know what kind of parts of speech each of the words are, whether it's a noun, a verb, and so on. Our model, of course, doesn't know that at all. It just knows the individual words. And so here are the results of CPL, the chunk-based learner, compared to several other models. So we had, for comparison, we had a variation of the model that uses forwards translation probabilities. And then we have two more traditional models that just have full trigrams, either using backwards translation probabilities or forward translation probabilities. And these are sort of baseline models that have been shown to be quite powerful in computational linguistics. And we can see here these results are averaged across 33 individual child corpora of English. And we can see that our CPL model outperforms the other models. We were able to find shallow parsers for German and French, and we similarly found that the model outperformed the other models there as well. So what about language production then? Well, so the idea is that when the model is trying to comprehend the input, and then as soon as we come across a sentence, an utterance in the corpus that the child produced, then it becomes a task of the model, given what it's learned so far, to recreate that utterance. So imagine the child said the cat chased the dog. What we do is we put those words in a bag, and then the task of the model then is to reproduce this utterance that the child uttered using knowledge in the chunkatory as well as chunk-to-chunk backwards translation probabilities, ideally then producing the cat chased the dog. Now in this case here, the gold standard is simply what the child said, which allows us to which allow us to look at a lot of different languages. And I want to note here that this gold standard is actually a very conservative measure of performance, because everything has to be right for it to get a 1 versus a 0. So for example, if the model instead produced the dog chased the cat, although that's a perfectly grammatical sentence, that would get a 0 in this case. And so using this method, we were able to model data from a typologically diverse set of 29 Old World languages covering 9 language families and 15 language genera. And these languages covers 4 different word orders: subject, verb, object, subject, object, verb, verb, subject, object, and flexible word order. So first we see the results here for English, just to orient you. What I've done here is taking the 3 bars with the 4 bars and overlaid them on top of each other. So when you see green sticking out here, then means that the CPL model have outperformed the other models. And we can see even on this rather conservative measure, the model is actually doing quite well. And across our 217 individual child simulations, we found that the CPL model outperformed its baseline for 26 of the 29 languages, the exception being Russian and Romanian, of which the FTP chunk model did better, and Korean, for which the backwards translation probabilities trigram model performed better. But we also wanted to push the model a little bit further to see whether they could discover lexical frames. That is the ability to generalize a bit beyond just the individual multi-word chunks. And we did that by making a very small change to the model, so that essentially whenever it had multiple instances of overlapping chunks, such as in the box, in the morning, in the back, in the garden, when it got a fifth variation of that in the air, the model would then add another chunk with an open slot in there where it could put individual words in there. And then it just added that to its chunkatory and used that for production. And the model discovered a number of interesting frames. So that the top 5 frames, and this was done fully automatically, whereas a much previous word on lexical frames has sort of a hand sort of picking feature in it. The top 5 frames, not surprisingly, are things like the, something, you're, in there, on there. But we also found some interesting frames, so such as a big, something, I want to, and even frames that actually involve having the slot in the middle, so on your own, on his own, on my own, and so on, could be used to generate by that. And using these frames, the model that incorporated that then outperformed all other models. So here we can see in yellow the model that has lexical frames abilities, and that actually added about 10 percentage points on top of previous performance, so it increased performance quite dramatically across all the 217 individual child simulations. So to recap, what we've seen here is that it's possible to model language acquisition given sort of the constraints of the now-and-now bottleneck using a chunk-based model that incorporate both incremental and online learning. And this model can model lexical frames cross-linguistically, as just shown you. It can also additionally model data from developmental experiments, for example, relative clause processing in children. It shows the kind of comprehension production asymmetry we typically see in young children. And it can even be pressed into using to look at chunk use in L1 and L2 speakers as well. And importantly, this model has no separation of acquisition from processing. Acquisition simply involves becoming better at chunking in the service of language processing. But returning to the issue of evolution that I started with, we might ask whether constraints on chunking might also be able to drive the cultural evolution of language. And here I'll turn to some work I've done in collaboration with Hannah Cornish, Rick Dale from UCLA, Simon Kirby from University of Edinburgh. And we explored this question using the kind of cultural submission paradigm that have become sort of quite influential in recent work on language evolution. And so the idea is sort of more generally that the now and never bottleneck not only influences language processing and language acquisition, but also provides an important constraints on language evolution, because each individual is part of a broader speech community that together help shape the cultural evolution of language. And the particular kind of experimental paradigm we used is sort of essentially akin to a language-based, a lab-based game of telephone. So of course, the game of telephone is a sort of a game where children sort of stand in a long row. The first child will come up with either a word or a sentence that they will whisper into the ear of the next kid. That kid, whatever they heard, they'll whisper into the ear of the next kid, and so on and so on. And then the last kid will then say aloud whatever that word was, and that typically will be whatever that sentence was. Will typically completely different, often with sort of quite humorous effect. Now, essentially, what we do in cultural evolution studies is sort of something very similar, but actually in the lab. So you get a person coming into the lab, they learn something, you test them, you give it to the next person that comes into the lab, and so on and so forth. It's pretty much in the same way. So it's kind of like a lab-based game of telephone experiment. Now, previous work along these lines have typically used some sort of miniature language that has meaning or reference, but we wanted to find out whether chunking biases in and by themselves could lead to the cultural evolution of structure independent of any kind of language-like task. So what we did was that we invited people to participate in what they were told was a memory experiment. That was sort of the pretext. And in that experiment, they would be exposed to strings of consonants. There would be, in the initial generation, there would be 3 to 5 consonants long, and we drew from 6 different consonants. And importantly, initially there would be a flat distribution, so there'd be no sort of distribution regularities in this initial language. And participants would first be exposed to 15 consonant string. They would see a string on the screen. It would disappear. They would type it in. A new one would appear. They would on the screen it would disappear. They would type it in. And they'll go through 6 blocks of this kind of exposure, and then they would be asked to recall all 15 strings, which of course they had some problems with, but we asked them to give us 15 strings nonetheless. We would then take the output that an individual would give us, we would recode it to avoid things like anagrams or typing biases, essentially do a remapping, so what might before be an X might now be an M, and so on. And then we would give that to the next participant that came into the lab. And we would have 10 participants in each sort of evolutionary chain. And what we found was that across generations, you can see here, this is sort of the average across multiple chains, we would see that there would be a gradual increase in distributional structure as measured by the relative frequency of reuse of bigrams and trigrams, bigrams being 2 consecutive consonants and trigrams being 3 consecutive consonants. But of course, an interesting question, does it affect learning at all? And indeed it does. We found that there was a significant increase in how well they could recall these consonant strings at the final generation compared to the initial generation. So initially they could only recall a little under 4 items, where at the end they could recall over half the items that they were exposed to. But perhaps this simply happened because the items became shorter overall. But actually that wasn't the case. There was no significance in the length of the 15 items initially compared to finally. So what's going on here then? Well, we adopted network analysis to look at possible structural reuse across generations. So essentially shared chunks across the 15 items. And we did that by essentially taking all the items and connecting them if they share a bigram chunk. And so the color indicates how tightly connected a bigram chunk is. So you can see that they become more and more connected across generations. But how might this relate to any kind of language? So in order to look closer into that, we compared it to child-directed speech. So we extracted 3 to 6 word sequences from childis. But of course, we needed a smaller number of elements rather than individual words. So we used parts of speech tags instead. And then we created a network from that and then wanted to compare it with our experimental network. So, but we also needed to have some sort of baseline, and we did that by essentially shuffling the elements within strings. And so the purpose of that is that the shuffling removes the sequential structure of a given string, and that should therefore disrupt any kind of interconnectedness of the resulting network. So our prediction was that we should see similar connectivity patterns for experimental and the language networks from the childless database. And indeed, this is what we found. So what you see here are changes in structural reuse across generations as a function of string length. So we have proportion connectedness and we have string length here. And the red lines are the shuffled networks, and the blue is the original data. And as you can see here, that initially there's not much different, but we can see that we get more structural reuse in the experimental networks across time. And in the final generation, we can see when we compare the final generation with the chunk reuse in child-directed speech, we see a very similar degree of structural reuse. And indeed, statistically, they're indistinguishable from another. So to recap, we see that it's that language-like distributional regularities emerged across time, across generations in these experiments facilitating learning. And we see similar patterns of structural reuse in both experimental and child-directed speech networks. Constraints on memory-based processes of chunking in the here and now may have contributed to the shaping of aspects of linguistic structure across time. But what are the implications of this chunk-based account for how we should think about the mental representation of language? And to look into that, a current graduate student with me at Aarhus University, Yngve Nielsen, and I conducted a series of experiments to explore the notion of a more abstract level of chunk-based representation above the level of specific multi-word chunks, which is what I've sort of focused on so far. Now, we know from the growing bulk of work on multi-word chunks in language learning and processing that they appear to function as akin to a building block for language learning and use. And so, for example, we've shown in some of our work that compositional multi-word chunks are processed similarly to idiomatic phrases. We also found that early acquired chunks are responded to faster than later acquired chunks, thus showing age of acquisition effects. But the question is, can we find evidence of something like more abstract representation of multi-word chunks, something that would be more akin to the kind of parts of speech sequences that we saw in the iterated sequence learning experiments that I just told you about? And so what Yngve and I set out to do was to conduct a parts of speech sequence priming experiment in order to show that there if these sequences can be primed, that would suggest that there is some sort of representation of them. And so essentially what we did was that we wanted to see whether the target response for this sequence of words, know the girl, which has essentially verb determinant noun, whether the response times for that would be faster when it's preceded by a similar combination of parts of speech, but completely different words, compared to a control condition where we had a completely different set of parts of speech, but words that have similar frequency, in this case here. And what we did was that we used a multi-word decision task for this experiment. And this task is modeled on the classic lexical decision task. It just involves multiple words rather than one. And the task is for people to determine as quickly and as accurately as possible whether a sequence of words could form part of an English sentence. So, for example, if they see take a break, they would say yes, versus ending you see, they would say no. And what we found when we subtract the experimental, when the target was preceded by either the actual prime versus the control prime, we actually found that a facilitation of the target response, as you can see here, meaning that multi-word sequences can be primed. And that suggests that we have some sort of representation of the sequence of parts of speech in these multi-word chunks, which is, I think, a very exciting result. However, we wanted to push this a little bit more because in the analysis of child-directed speech that I talked about previously, we found in the sort of cultural transmission study, we found that there was reuse both of constituent parts of speech sequences like you see here that we looked at so far, but also of non-constituent parts of sequences. So the question is, might non-constituent parts of speech sequences perhaps also be primed and thus in some sense represented? And so to test that, we added a condition where we would have as target non-constituent parts of speech sequences, three-word parts of speech sequences, so such as verb, conjunction, and pronoun, that either preceded by similar parts of speech, non-constituent parts of speech sequence, versus another sequence that again would have different parts of speech, but again be controlled for frequency and so on. So the question is, would we also see priming here using the exact same task? And so here's the constituent priming results again. And here you can see that we actually also get a priming effect for non-constituent parts of speech sequences. And if anything, we get a slightly larger priming effect. Now, we were quite excited about this, but also wanted to make sure that this actually was not a fluke. So we conducted a second experiment with a new set of stimuli and a new set of participants. And we were able to replicate this effect of non-constituent parts of speech sequences being primed. But we also want to see, well, actually, does this hold outside this phrasal decision task? So what we did was we conducted an analysis of the self-paced reading data from the natural stories corpus collected by Futrell et al. And this corpus consists of 10 stories, each consisting of about 10,000 words, 1,000 words, sorry, that people just read through self-paced reading. And indeed, what we found was that non-constituent parts of speech sequences would actually prime subsequent occurrences of the same parts of non-constituent parts of speech sequence, resulting in faster reading time relative to non-primed parts of speech sequences, as you can see here. And this priming effect, of course, as one might expect, would is with as a distance from the between the prime and the target increase, which is what you might expect. And the priming effect was actually similar to what we found for constituent parts of speech sequences, as you can see here. And also as a sanity check, we also looked at priming of just simple individual words, and we see similar pattern here as well. So to recap, in this study, we have found evidence across 5 experiments. There's 2 extra experiments that I haven't had time to talk about. We found evidence that multi-word parts of speech sequences can be primed, and remarkably, this also applies to non-constituent parts of speech sequences. And I think this calls for a reappraisal of how we should think about syntactic priming results that have been an important part of the psycholinguistic literature. So rather than thinking of linguistic representation in terms of syntactic trees, it might be more useful for us to think of mental representations of linguistic structures as corresponding to something akin to a processing history. And if that's the case, then perhaps the non-constituent parts of speech sequences might function as something like processing glue that connect processing patterns for different constructions or constituents. And with that, let me briefly conclude. So following Darwin, I have suggested that linguistic structure primarily is a product of cultural evolution, not biological adaptation. And importantly, this means that we need to uncover that the kind of constraints that work across these multiple timescales of evolution, acquisition, and processing. And here I pointed to one such constraint in the now and never bottleneck, and how to get around that we use basic memory processes of chunking that has subsequently shaped the evolution, acquisition, and processing of language. And this perspective also has implications for how we might think of the nature of linguistic representation, which I've suggested we might think of as akin to processing history. And so overall, if we want to understand how language works, I think that requires a highly integrated approach that relies on evidence across multiple timescales, from evolution to acquisition to processing. And with that in mind, I want to thank you all for listening. And if you're interested in more of the work, there's 2 recent books here of mine that go into more detail. So thank you for listening.
Thank you, Morten, for the inspiring, as expected, presentation. I would like to start with asking people online whether they have any questions, anything they want to discuss. So please raise a hand or type something into the chat. I don't see any. Kyla McConnell. Bear with me. Okay. I'm trying to manage this, right? Usually someone else is doing this, but this person is on holiday today, so it's a bit slower today than usually. Is this the right? Ask to unmute? Yeah.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, hi, I'm Kyla. I'm at the MPI in Nijmegen. Thanks for this really interesting talk. I've been thinking about this trend to watch like videos or listen to podcasts on a faster speed, like double speed. And I'm wondering if this would sort of heighten the bottleneck or increase the time constraint on language comprehension, and whether you would expect to see some sort of effect of this on representations in some subtle way, or if it's rather that either you can successfully chunk and pass or you can't and you just don't understand anymore.
That's a good question. I imagine that, if you spend a lot of time doing that, you might become a little bit better at doing it, but there's likely going to be limitations to that. And I mean, one of the things that might make it slightly easier when you're doing it on podcast is that one thing I really didn't get into, but that we talk a lot about in the language game, is the fact that language really also need to be understood in the context of conversation with other people, which is sort of the normal way in which we sort of use language. And in that regard, so for example, as Stephen Levinson and others have shown, that you actually not only have to sort of process what the other person is saying, but you also have to start preparing your response at the same time. And that sort of puts a lot of limitations on what you can do. That's why I think for conversations, we couldn't really do sort of this kind of speed up. But for when you're just listening to something and you don't actually have to make your response, you can probably get by with sort of increasing the speed a little bit. But when it comes to sort of normal interaction, I don't think that will work that well because of these other factors that come into play. But for it, you're right that many people like to listen to podcasts at a faster speed. So likewise, people might also later on listen to this or watch this talk at increased speed. I have to sit through a whole hour of a talk, for example, which I do myself also. So
great, thanks.
More questions from the online audience. Sonia Frota is next to ask a question.
Yes. Do you hear me?
yes.
Yes. Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I would like to ask you about the computational model, and the results that you presented focused on differences in performance across models. For example, the sentence production accuracy data that you presented. But when we look at that, we also see, apparently at least, we also see differences across languages. And I wonder whether you have any insight on why some languages fare better than others.
Yeah, so it's a good question, and we actually have done some analysis of some of the things. So first, there are some just purely trivial differences that have to do with the size of the corpus. So some of the corpora were just very small, and so that led to poor performance overall. So that's sort of kind of like not very interesting. But some of the other things have to do with, for example, the way the corpora are transcribed. So one of the things that the model doesn't pick up on, but that we know is important for a number of languages, is pick up on morphological patterning. So for the model, essentially, whether there's a particular inflection on a word, the model will treat them as different words. So we have been working on a variation on the model that deals with sort of more morphologically complex languages, but we did find that the model tended to do worse on more morphologically complex languages because it didn't really have any insights into the complex morphology. But we have some ideas of how we might deal with that, but we haven't done that yet. But that's a good question. So that's the more interesting part of this variation across languages. But some of it is just purely based on sort of boring stuff like just how much data is available.
Thank you.
Okay, I think Nermin Yusuf, you want to ask a question, or is it just that you asking for the reference for this experiment that was just discussed? I'll just unmute you, then you can answer. Sorry. Only reference. Okay. Maybe Morten can just mention the journal and the year and the title of the paper from this last study that's just been discussed for our.
Well, the most recent one, it's not published yet. That's why it's submitted. So okay. The one with the parts of speech priming.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that one is not published yet. But if you email me, I can send you the paper.
Perfect. Okay, are there more questions in the online audience? I don't see any raised hands, so please make yourself seen if you want to ask a question. Doesn't seem to be the case. Then I'll ask in the room in Leipzig, Lorenzo and Chawen, whether they have any questions. Otherwise, I do have some. Lorenzo has a question. But there's also Saver. Lorenzo, you say, of course, right? We are polite hosts. Now Saver is gone. Asked to unmute.
Yeah, thank you so much. First of all, thank you so much for the presentation. It was really great. I just wanted to ask about the implications, the possible implication in language teaching. How does the chunk-based acquisition model influence the methods of language teaching, for example, in future, specifically in vocabulary teaching domain?
Do you mean for second language learning?
Exactly.
Yes. So actually, one interesting thing that the whole notion of sort of chunking and so on seem to have been picked up in second language learning. And in fact, there are several of my graduate students here at Cornell that are working on looking at that. And so we have some ideas for how to look at the role of chunking and how we might be able to facilitate second language learning by improving people's chunking ability. We have done some work and others have done too, that it seems that it's not that second language learners it's not that they're not able to chunk. However, they seem to be doing it in a slightly different way. So if we can facilitate doing chunking that's relevant for the particular language they're learning, that might improve their learning abilities. And so we have different ways that we are working on doing that. And in fact, one of my current graduate students, Serene Wong, and I have a paper that's just been accepted. It's a review paper of chunking in L1 and L2. So if you email me, I can send you a copy of that paper if you're interested. So that's a review paper. But there's also, I think there's a lot of opportunities for improving second language learning by way of drawing attention to chunking. And I just saw there was another paper I just saw come out that it was done in Japanese in Japan, looking at how chunking can be at the text level can be used to sort of improve second language learning.
Thank you so much.
I think there's a lot of possibility there. So, but yeah, feel free to email me and we can sort of talk more about it if you like.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for the questions in the online audience. Thank you for the discussion. And now it's Lorenzo's turn, I believe.
Yeah, thank you, Morten, for the very fascinating work. I have a question on the data that you showed on the experiment run over different generations on the chains of participants. I can't quite recall the data that you showed, but I remember seeing this graph over different generations, and I could see that the difference between your condition and the baseline was not really like linearly increasing over generation. There was some point in the process of at some step, I think in like Gen 5 or something, that where there wasn't really a difference. So I was wondering indeed if you had like some insights into how this like, yeah, exactly, this graphic, yeah. So it's a, yeah.
Well, so some of it is, so when you do this kind of learning, you do get, so this is average across multiple different chains. And within a given chain, you sometimes get a participant who might have paid less attention and so on. And that can sort of affect things. So that's why in general, it might take a little, it might not be sort of fully linear in the results that you get across time. That's sort of one of the potential issues with this kind of game. But essentially, once you get across a certain number of generations, you see the same kind of pattern emerging. You still see this coming. I mean, that it's not linear at all. So, but I don't know if we should necessarily read a lot into this, because part of it this kind of experiment can be a little bit noisy due to the contributions of individual learners in a chain can be sort of non-linear in some ways. Not sure that really answered your questions.
Yes, I do. Yeah, thank you.
I kind of had a follow-up, and maybe I think it's related, or a different way of phrasing what Lorenzo asked. There's something in the data that points to a specific length being preferred and being transmitted preferentially.
So in this analysis here focused on essentially bigram reuse, and essentially what you got is that you, of course, not surprisingly, the longer an item is, the more likely you are to get a reuse in that item. So that's what happened. But also I want to note that we also did similar kind of analysis. We just want to make sure that this wasn't just an artifact of how people recall stuff in general. So we also looked at people's passwords. So we found a database of password sequences, so that was around on the web, and then you can see here. So there you actually don't get this kind of effect at all. And likewise, if you ask people just to generate random digits, again you see sort of there's a slight chance of higher reuse as you go across, but you don't see the difference between the shuffle networks and the sort of what would be the experimental ones here. And so there does seem to be something special about this sort of increase in structural reuse across time in this iterated chunking experiment compared to what you might see in other kinds of human sequence recall.
All right, I have probably 1, 2, maybe even 3 questions if there's still time. I believe there is time, at least for us. So one thing, when you showed this concept of part of speech chunks, of course, I was reminiscing about like Tomasello's verb islands and so on, but just for a definitorial thing, would you think that's the same that construction grammarians use the word construction for? Is that related?
Yes and no. So I think it's related. So the constituent parts of speech sequences you could think of as akin to chunks to some degree, but the non-constituent ones I think are not really as straightforwardly mapped on to sort of say construction grammar or something like that. So I think most of what people have talked about in terms of multi-word combination, even at the more abstract levels, they always tend to be constituents, even though in construction grammar, they don't really talk about constituent structure as such, but they really overlap with that. And so what we found particularly interesting was that we were able to see this across 5 different experiments. We also did, for example, analysis of conversation, and we find that priming in alignment across interlocutors also showed similar kind of non-constituent priming as well. And we did a control experiment in which we reversed the order. We wanted to see, well, is it just the case that it's just the individual's parts of speech items that were primed And so what we did, we had an experiment where we simply reversed the order to see whether it's actually the specific order of parts of speech or just the individual items. And it turns out it's not just the parts of speech. So the reversed one didn't actually give you the priming that that we in there. So that does seem to be something about the representation of that is kind of interesting. And to be honest, when Yngve and I started talking about this, I wasn't quite sure I wanted to do these experiments because theoretically it's quite complicated to think about what is this, and this is why I talked about this processing glue, potentially that might tie together construction, so that might be constituent. So it provides a way of facilitating processing across time. That would be sort of the idea.
And a related question is actually a good transition. Of course, I'm guilty of working at a syntax kind of original institute, although it's not kind of my primary thing anymore. But still, when I'm taking what you just said about like what the priming effect is and what you think is the priming based on, I'm wondering, is there any need for an explicit notion of dependency in this whole idea? When you're assuming a chunkatory and that's what you're using to process most of speech in a shallow manner, do you need dependencies within your chunks, or can you even get away without these? Is it just like the contents of your memory basically that you're somehow making sense of, or do you need to explicitly connect certain words time and again?
So, I mean, this is based on other work. I don't think you need necessarily to have dependence at the syntactic level as much as there might be expectations you have more at the message or the semantic level. So I think but it's a longer story. But I want to note that, for example, the computational model I talked about earlier that I did with Stuart Macaulay, we were actually able to model data from Diesel and Tomasello about children's use of different kinds of relative clauses. And of course, that's thought of in terms of various kinds of dependencies, but the model there's nothing that would correspond to dependencies in this computational model, yet it was able to essentially mimic the data from these child studies of the way kids are using these relative clauses without any sort of notion of dependency. So I think it's an open question, but I do think that we have expectations, but I think they might be more at the semantic and the pragmatic level of what should be coming up, and that's what we have in previous analysis looked at the syntactic level. But I think it's really should be looked at a sort of higher, more integrated level. But that's a longer story.
Thank you, but that's a good answer. And then my final question, sorry for boring everyone. Speaking about acquisition, we and others have worked on timescales of acquisition, right? And there's this kind of traditional view that infants start with slow timescales and then they speed up their timing, and that has implications for the size of the units that they're operating on or that they're acquiring on even. And I was wondering whether the chunk-based learning studies, whether you've seen something like that, like a temporal kind of progression emerging in the data. And if not, how does that fit the human time scale, basically? Because the human time scale is constrained by ontogenesis, basically, and by maturation and by temporal changes there. Maybe you can share your thoughts on that.
So, I mean, the modeling that we've done doesn't really have that as a factor. So that would be something that one will have to look at separately. So that's one thing that the model is not sort of incorporating as such. But that's it. I think that's an interesting question, how some of the ideas behind the model could interface with the kind of data that you're talking about now. But in the working of the model right now, it doesn't really capture that, I'm afraid.
No. Thank you very much. This has been a very interesting discussion, a long discussion. A lot of people stayed with us, which really speaks for the quality of the speaker. I would like to close this language circle for today. Morten, you have some meetings with group members, I believe, including me, so I'm looking forward to that in a couple of minutes. Thank you all for being here. Everyone spread the word. The language circle is happening. We will announce the next iteration on Twitter. Everyone, have a good day and see you at the next language circle. Bye.
Bye-bye, and thanks for having me.